Hello everyone. In this lecture, we are going to learn the theory of Vakrokti propounded by the 10th century Kashmiri critic Rājanaka Kuntaka. Kuntaka, who lived in Kashmir in the 10th century, is primarily known for his magnum opus Vakrokti-Jīvita. Prologue in his Rasa reader says that the only work in the Sanskrit tradition that can be likened to what today we would regard as literary criticism is Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita. In his introduction to Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita, Krishnamurti also makes a similar observation. According to him, in the whole range of Sanskrit poetical theory, we do not have anyone who can be termed a practical literary critic in the modern sense of the term except for Kuntaka. Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita was thought to have been lost forever for a long time. A glance at the various stages through which Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita was reconstructed bears testimony to the amount of energy and meticulous research that went into this process. Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita, which was long thought to be lost and known only through the citations in the later texts of Kavya Shastra, is now available to us primarily through the efforts of S.K. De and Krishnamurti. A glance at the various stages through which Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita was reconstructed or reproduced actually bears testimony to the amount of energy, effort, and research that went into this great process. Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita was long thought to be lost, and it was known only through citations in later texts of Kavya Shastra, and it is available to us now primarily through the efforts of S.K. De and Krishnamurti. S.K. De brought out a copy of Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita in 1923 based on two Devanagari transcripts of a Malayalam manuscript, which was also lost at some point from the Oriental Manuscript Library in Madras. The manuscript seemed to have contained 4 chapters, but the last chapter in the manuscript broke off without any conclusion. The 3rd chapter also contained a lot of gaps in it, so they was unable to publish a readable text. However, he brought out an edition of Kuntaka's Vakrokti-Jīvita with the first 2 chapters and a resume of the contents of the last 2 chapters. This arrangement was still necessary even in the 2nd edition in 1922, when a new edition of Vakrokti-Jīvita was brought out after a new manuscript was formed in Jaisalmer. Despite these limitations, his edition was quite crucial in introducing Kuntaka's idea of Vakrokti to the readers of modern India. A coherent and readable text of Vakrokti-Jīvita along with a translation came out in 1977 through the efforts of Krishnamurti. For this edition, Krishnamurti collected a transcript of the last 2 chapters of the Madras manuscript and combined it with the same portions of the new Jaisalmer manuscript and the Vakrokti-Jīvita extracts in the Kalpalata Viveka. For the first 2 chapters, he made use of the Jaisalmer manuscript along with De's 1928 edition. These efforts finally came to fruition in the form of a readable text for Vakrokti-Jīvita. The Sanskrit word Vakrokti is a portmanteau word composed of 2 words, namely Vakrata and Ukti, meaning respectively deviant and utterance. So the word Vakrokti literally means deviant utterance or a striking usage. In the realm of Sanskrit Kavya Shastra, Bhamaha is the first literary theoretician to use the term Vakrokti. Before Bhamaha, Bharata had employed the idea of deviant utterance in his Natya Shastra without using the term Vakrokti per se. Bharata used the term Lakshana to refer to what his successors would call Vakrokti. Bhamaha employed the term Vakrokti in connection with his discussion of the figure of speech called Atishayokti. According to Bhamaha, Atishayokti is the treatment of an object or idea in such a way that it appears strikingly new to the readers. In other words, in the figure of speech called Atishayokti, an object or entity transcends our familiar equations of perceiving it. The following is an example of Atishayokti which Bhamaha cites in Kavyalankara. If the loose skin of water drops down like the slough of serpents, then it will become the white garments on the limbs of ladies spotting on in the water. In this example, Bhamaha gives us a deviant and the hitherto unfamiliar equation of perceiving water. The dominant conception about water is that it is a colorless, odorless liquid which forms water bodies such as river, ocean, pond, and so on. By considering water as a white garb on the limbs of ladies playing in the water, Bhamaha is altering the dominant conception about water. According to Bhamaha, Atishayokti is identical with Vakrokti or deviant utterance, and all poets should take special care to master this art of deviant utterance. In Kavyalankara, Bhamaha says, this Atishayokti is nothing but Vakrokti. All meanings appear new by this. Poets should be assiduous in cultivating it. Where is an Alankara without this? Bhamaha says that ordinary expressions which reproduce the dominant way we perceive entities without any figurative deviation should not be considered an Alankara, and the matter-of-fact expressions bereft of Vakrata are mere Varta or report, not Kavya or poetry. Bhamaha observes, the sun has set, the moon shines, the birds are winging back to their nests. What kind of poetry is this? This is called Varta. Holding Vakrokti in high esteem, Bhamaha is reluctant to consider Swabhavokti or the act of presenting something in the way it is commonly perceived as an Alankara. While describing 5 kinds of Kavya, Bhamaha reiterates that Kavya in any form becomes commendable only if it is characterized by deviant utterance. For him, a composition which is clear, smooth, and elegant, but devoid of deviant utterance, will be mere music, not Kavya. According to Dandin, the successor of Bhamaha, the whole universe of speech can be divided into 2, namely Vakrokti and Swabhavokti. Vamana holds that Vakrokti is subsumed in the secondary usage based on similarity, Sadrishya Lakshana Vakrokti, and is just a Shabda Alankara. The first literary theoretician to use the term Vakrokti as a separate poetic figure is the 9th century Kashmiri critic Rūḍhi-vaicitrya. As far as Rūḍhi-vaicitrya was concerned, Vakrokti is an Alankara which can be divided into 2 broad categories, namely Shlesha Vakrokti and Kagu Vakrokti. Shlesha Vakrokti is Vakrokti based on pun, whereas Kagu Vakrokti is Vakrokti based on the tone of voice. According to Rūḍhi-vaicitrya, a sentence uttered in one sense by a speaker and taken in another sense by a listener because of the double meaning of the word, it is called Shlesha Vakrata or Vakrata of pun. Sometimes, because of a change in the speaker's intonation, there is a change in the meaning of a sentence. It is called Kagu Vakrata or Vakrata of tone. Anandavardhana, a contemporary of Rūḍhi-vaicitrya in the court of King Avantivarman, also refers to the concept of Vakrokti in his Dhvanyaloka. In the 3rd Udyota or chapter of Dhvanyaloka, Ananda subscribes to Bhamaha's opinion that Vakrata, which is identical with Atishayokti, is the very life force of all Alankaras. Ananda observes, all hyperboles are deviant utterances. By it, meaning is exalted. A poet must take pains with it. What is figure of speech without it? In Dhvanyaloka, Anandavardhana further reaffirms the importance of Vakrata when he sarcastically talks about a fool's conception of a good kavya. Abhinava's commentary on this passage is also important in connection with our discussion of Vakrokti. In his commentary, Abhinava opines that Vakrata is identical with sublime Sankhadana, Vakrokti Ulkrishta Sankhadana, and the lack of Vakrata means the absence of beauty. Abhinava says, striking turn of speech or Vakrata, elevated style or arrangement, Sankhadana, that it lacks this implies that it lacks the qualities of sound and meaning. You can refer to Lochana for this. Bhoja in his Sringara Prakasha opines that there is no kavya without Vakrokti. He divides the whole universe of speech into vachas and kavya. While vachas is the representation of objects and ideas in the way they are dominantly perceived or presented in daily life, kavya is marked by vakrata or deviant utterance. Mammada in his Kavya Prakasha sees Vakrokti in both its narrow and broad senses. In its narrow sense, the term Vakrata is a category of Shabdalankara. He says, when what is said by one person in one sense is construed by another person in a different sense, either through punning or through intonation, it is called equivoque or Vakrokti. Like Rudrada, Mammada divides Vakrata into two categories of Shabdalankara, namely Shlesha Vakrokti and Kaku Vakrokti. In its broadest sense, Mammada sees Vakrokti as the essence of all Alankaras, quoting Bhamaha's dictum that Adishyokti is identical with Vakrokti and there is no Alankara without it. Sharing the opinion of Mammada, Rūyaka sees Vakrokti first as a category of Shabdalankara and later as the life force of all Alankaras. He also divides Vakrokti into Kaku Vakrokti and Shlesha Vakrokti. For Vishwanatha and Vishweshwara, Vakrokti is a mere ornament of sound. Vidyanatha, Jayadeva, Appaya Dikshita, Bhatta, Devashankara, Purohita and Amrdananda Yogin treat Vakrokti as an Arthalankara. Considering Vakrokti as the ultimate locus of literariness in Kavya, many practicing poets call themselves unparalleled experts in the employment of Vakrokti. For instance, the poet Kaviraja in his Raghava Pandaviya names himself Subandhu and Banabhata as the only three experts in the employment of Vakrokti. He asks, Subandhu, Bana and Kaviraja are the only three masters of deviant utterance. Can there be a fourth one? Later, in the early 13th century, Vidyamadhava adds his own name to this list and confidently declares that there could not be a fifth one. In his Parvati Rukminiya, a work modelled on Kaviraja's Raghava Pandaviya, Vidyamadhava remarks, Bana, Subandhu, Kaviraja and I, the erudite scholar of Vidyamadhava, are the only four masters of deviant utterance in this world. There will never ever be a fifth one. In Kavya tradition, the first major literary work that overtly claims to make use of the possibilities of Vakrokti is the 9th century Kashmiri poet Ratnakara's Vakrokti Panchashika. Vakrokti Panchashika can be rightly called the most influential specimen of the nascent genre of Vakrokti poetry. This short poem portrays goddess Parvati's attempts to break up with her husband Shiva and Shiva's attempts to assuage her anger through the skillful employment of deviant utterance or Vakrokti. Shiva playfully evades Parvati's complaints by intentionally taking them in a sense which Parvati does not intend, thereby dragging their conversation to the point of Parvati finally reconciling with him. Other poems modelled on Ratnakara's skillful use of deviant utterance in Vakrokti Panchashika include Shivarama's Lakshmi Saraswati Samvada and the anonymous Rambha Shuga Samvada, and Girija Kamala Vivada. Lakshmi Saraswati Samvada portrays the verbal fencing between Lakshmi and Saraswati, the rival wives of Vishnu and Shiva. Rambha Shuga Samvada deals with the dialogue between the ascetic Shuga and the celestial woman Rambha, who has come to the earth to seduce Shuga. And Girija Kamala Vivada is in the form of a dialogue between Parvati and Lakshmi. It is also important to note that the entire Sanskrit Kavya Shastra tradition has seen Kavya as a systematic deviation or Vakrata from the ordinary form of speech. In the first chapter, critics like Phamaha, Dandin, Utpada, Anandavardhana, Abhinavagupta, Mamada and so on treated literature as a conscious departure from the quotidian use of language. This shows that the idea of Vakrokti or deviant utterance was a central concern throughout Sanskrit literary tradition. Although Phamaha laid out the basic framework of the idea of Vakrokti, and his successors like Dandin, Rudrada and Anandavardhana took it up in their poetic theory, none of them in fact treated the idea of Vakrokti as a major concern of their critical enquiry. We find a very detailed exposition of the idea of Vakrokti only in Vakrokti Jivita of the 10th century Kashmiri critic Kuntaka. Vakrokti Jivita, as I have pointed out in the introduction of this study, came down to us in a somewhat fragmentary form without any commentary, and the text still remains incomplete without the last chapter. However, since all the major topics that Kuntaka promises to take up in the text are covered in the first 3 chapters of Vakrokti Jivita, we have all the reasons to believe that or think that nothing much of the text has been lost. His florid compositional style, which is a clear departure from the usual way of employing Sanskrit in literary treatises, seems to be an open endorsement of the critical position he talks about in his text. According to Kuntaka, the very essence of Kavya is Vakrata, or the art of presenting something in a fashion which is antithetical to the way we have experienced it so far. According to Kuntaka, the sound and sense in Kavya necessarily need to be adorned with the ornament called Vakrata. Kuntaka defines Vakrokti as that signification which is different from the popular usage. He calls it Prasiddhabhidhana Vyatirekini. He primarily saw Vakrokti as the portrayal of sound and sense in a deviant form, so that the familiar, ordinary objects around us appear different. According to Kuntaka, what made a narrative a verbal art was the presence of Alankara, and the only Alankara or ornament that could adorn a poem was Vakrokti. Kuntaka says, both these refer to words and meanings which deserves to be looked upon as the subjects of ornamentation for the enhancement of their appeal. What then is this ornament? One might ask. The answer is that though they are 2 in number, they have only one common ornament. What exactly is this ornament? Artistic turn of speech is the reply. It stands for a charming and novel utterance peculiar to poetry and distinct from familiar usage. It is the very index of the artistic turn that a master poet's speech takes. In other words, artistic utterance itself is the ornament in question. Kuntaka clearly differentiated Vakrokti and Swabhavokti, maintaining that Swabhavokti is nothing more than the description of objects in nature, and it would not qualify to be a part of poetry. Instead of recreating or representing the dominant conception about the identity of an entity or Swabhava, Kuntaka, like Shklovsky much later, was concerned with the creative transformation of the existing structures, and he never aimed to reproduce the known and the familiar. Kuntaka says, The gist is, the poets do not give existence to things non-existent in the world. Only they endow such superior and original excellence to things which merely existed before, that a unique appeal to beauty to connoisseurs is invariably brought about. Things in the world have mere existence, but they are given such heightened, extraordinary beauty or shade of charm that they began to appear as if they are entirely new. Their natural state is completely concealed, and a new splendor comes to be attached to them, making one think that they were invented right then for the first time. It is this fact which confers the title of creators on the poets. This is somewhat similar to the concept of defamiliarization that was propounded by Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian formalist, in the 20th century. Shklovsky's observation merits attention in this context. He says, the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Kuntaka's theory of Vakrokti poses a very strong resistance to the habitual frameworks of performance and perception, and sees literature as a transformative act which presents the familiar objects in a defamiliarized fashion. This act of defamiliarization, in the first instance, is a liberating experience for the author, in the sense that it provides the author with an opportunity to transcend the familiar equations of perception and performance. In this process, it also releases the entity which is being portrayed in Kavya from our rigid, conventional conception about it. Equally liberating is the experience of the reader who encounters an instance of deviant utterance. Through their encounter with the hitherto unseen facet of a familiar object, readers broaden the horizon of their perception and experience what is called atishaya or surprise. It is also significant to note that despite Kuntaka's insistence on the employment of Vakrata in Kavya, he never aimed to shock his readers by presenting something so differently that it breaks the norms of aujitya or propriety in the society. Vakrokti for Kuntaka is always subordinate to the idea of social propriety and the feeling of surprise and pleasure. Kuntaka divides Vakrokti into 6 broad categories such as varna-vinyasa-vakrata, pada-purvartha-vakrata, pada-paryāya-vakratā, vakya-vakrata, prakarana-vakrata, and prabandha-vakrata. We will soon see all these varieties of Vakrokti in detail. I hope you have understood all the major lessons we discussed today.